in the course of my work in running the Aquamarine Fund, I get to talk to a wide variety of people, which is a really enjoyable part of what I do. And every now and then, the ostensible reason why I'm talking to somebody morphs into something completely different and in a certain way far more interesting. And that's what happened with Arthur Fine when he started talking to me about Aloha Medical Missions. And I realized that somebody who holds himself out as a mere lawyer, a very good one at that, actually is the man behind an extraordinary charity that is quietly delivering extraordinary amounts of highly needed healthcare to people who couldn't get it in any other way, shape, or form. And so I was excited to invite him onto the podcast, and even more excited that Georgina is going to be interviewing him. She does a far better job than I do. Enjoy.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Guy. And Art, what a delight to speak to you about your background and the work that you do as a board member of Aloha Medical Mission, that's AMM, and one of the primary coordinators of the non-profit surgical missions. Now, you're now 79, and I'd like to go back in time to get some idea of your early life. Was philanthropy something that your family were involved in?
No, I've got to tell you that I was very busy from a young age because Margie and I were married when I was 20 and she was 18. And, about 10 months later, we had our first child, and we were both going to UC Berkeley. Being married so young, having a child when we did, and trying to go to both undergraduate school and then graduate school kept us very busy. And then, as you know, I think you know, that Margie became a surgeon, and we had very busy professional lives with 2 children to raise. So our philanthropic activities were pretty limited, mostly contributing money to various causes. And every now and again, I would take a pro bono case, like representing the Nature Conservancy. And that was most of our philanthropic activities.
When you were studying, you decided to become a lawyer. What prompted that decision?
I remember reading various books about trials and trial attorneys and Clarence Darrow, and that was something that I always had an interest in. But I got to tell you, it was by default in part. I was one of these students that didn't have to study and did extraordinarily well. And when I ended up going to UC Berkeley, I found there were a lot of very good students. And I started a major in physics, and I was not getting my usual very high grades because I wasn't studying, and I had too many other bright people there. And I realized I either had to study or I had to switch majors where I could use inductive and deductive reasoning, argument, and writing, and then I would be fine. So being rather lazy, I switched majors. And switching majors, I realized the next best thing that I was interested in potentially going into was law.
And what kind of law did you practice?
Well, I started with a smaller firm, even though for most of my career it was with a larger firm. So I did both litigation and transactional work. And then gradually it became all litigation. But because I had such a broad background, I worked in almost every area that you could work in business litigation. So I first started doing intellectual property and patent litigation. From there, it went to securities litigation, and then general corporate law, contract law, real estate law, environmental law, antitrust, you name it, I did it. I particularly did anything that had a technical aspect to it because of my technical background, and anything with a financial aspect to it. And if it was particularly esoteric, they were looking around for somebody who had some experience, they would say, oh, give it to Art. He's got some experience in everything.
Well, now tell us a little bit more about Marjorie, because you've been married now for what, 60 years?
That's right, very close to 60 years. Margie was the real academic star in our family. Margie would have graduated from Berkeley at 18, but for the fact that we had a child. And so she was out for a year and graduated at 19. She then proceeded to help put me through law school by working. And she worked with the molecular biology labs of Berkeley. And we then decided that an important part of our education was to live and work abroad. And I took a teaching position in the law school, University of Auckland, New Zealand. And Margie ended up working at the Auckland Hospital, helping to set up a program for people who either had excess insulin or deficient amount of insulin, or excess growth hormone or insufficient growth hormone. A doctor there was running the program for the entire country. He had to measure the amounts of these hormones in the patient's blood, and they had to send these samples to Canada or the United States because they had to run what was called an immunoassay program on the samples. And although they had the papers for setting up an immunoassay program and could afford the equipment, they had no one that they felt was sufficiently knowledgeable to actually set it up in either Australia or New Zealand. And so they sent it away, and it was taking 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get the results. And Margie was watching all this, and she said to Dr. Scott, who was running the program, she said, you know, you shouldn't have to be sending these things out. He said, well, we have no one who can set up this immunoassay program for us. Margie said, I'll set it up. He said, what are you talking about? You're 22 years old. We don't have anybody in all of Australia and New Zealand who can do this. And Margie said, well, look, I worked at the molecular biology labs. I was working for someone who thought he was going to win the Nobel Prize, and he turned over his entire lab to me, and I ran it. There isn't anything I can't do in a laboratory. And so turned it over, and she set up this program. It worked. She trained people, and then they came to her and they said, well, gee, you worked in the molecular biology labs. That's a whole new subject for us. Can you sort of teach our doctors and our medical students something about molecular biology? And she said, sure. So she originally was interested in endocrinology because that's the doctor she was working for was an endocrinologist. And she decided that she wanted to go to medical school, and she applied. She was 25 when she applied. She was a little older. They accepted her. She had unbelievable letters of recommendation. She was the first woman with children ever accepted to UCLA Medical School. And she went through, and she was first in her class, and also won their second most prestigious award, the Surgery Award. And in the process of going through medical school, she decided she wanted to be a surgeon. Well, there were very few surgeons, women surgeons in the United States. They had never accepted a woman in surgery in UCLA, not in their history, in any surgical department. They didn't think a woman could possibly go through surgery. And here they had a woman who was married, had 2 children, and they just didn't think it was really appropriate, but there was no way they could turn her down. The civil rights laws didn't exist in the United States, so legally they could have turned her down, but after all, she was a UCLA graduate from their medical school, #1 in her class, and won the surgery award. So they didn't have any choice. They accepted her, and she turned out to be one of the best, if not the best resident that went through their program. They went out of their way to train her because they were afraid they might be embarrassed by her. And they saw how good she was. And every time they had a visitor, a Nobel Prize visitor, they trotted Margie out. And they now have an endowed chair at UCLA named after Margie.
And so basically, I mean, you have had the best part of a lifetime, at least tangentially exposed and connecting with medicine. So now we come to this fantastic initiative, Aloha Medical Mission, which uses the strapline, bringing hope and changing the lives of the people we serve overseas and in Hawaii. How did you first become aware of AMM?
Well, as Margie decided to slow down in her practice. She decided that she was very interested in providing surgery to the developing world. That's one of the greatest needs of all, because in most of the developing world, they neither have surgeons outside of, say, the capital city or major cities, and they have a very small percent of their population who could afford surgery, even if surgeons were available. So if you study what the needs are in the developing world, that's one of the greatest needs. And there are very few medical missions that are concentrated on surgery, because it's so much more difficult to do a surgical mission compared to a medical mission in terms of having the operating rooms, the necessary equipment, the supplies, as well as having all the necessary people with the expertise, the anesthesiologists, the surgeons, all the surgical nurses that you need, pre-op, post-op, and all the nurses actually in the operating room, what they call the scrub nurses and the circulating nurses. And so she was looking around for an organization that did surgical missions. To start with, she readily found that very few existed. And those that did exist basically had a religious bent. In essence, they were going over there and providing the surgery to have the opportunity to proselytize. And she had no interest in that. She wanted an organization that provided surgery on a non-sectarian basis, purely on the basis that they needed the surgery and could not otherwise afford it. And a friend, another surgeon, told her about Aloha, and she contacted Bradley Wong, who was then the president of Aloha, and decided to go on a mission. And I think her first mission was either to Nepal or the Philippines. And by that time, I had already gotten involved in prosthetic hands and become very knowledgeable about prosthetic hands. We had a friend by the name of Ernie Meadows who recently died. And he was a design engineer. And he sold his business, and he had an unbelievable workshop at his house that was probably several thousand square feet. And he had every conceivable kind of machine that would do anything and everything to any kind of material. And he sat there and invented things. And he was working at the Southern California hospital as a volunteer with amputees. In the process, he was thinking about the prosthetic hands and how expensive they were and how cumbersome they would be in the developing world. And he did some research to find out whether or not there were any prosthetic hands available in the developing world, and found that there were none. You could get none that were reasonable for the developing world. And he decided that he was going to invent a hand that met certain criteria. The criteria is the least expensive in the Western world was a hook, 3 metal prongs that came together as you bent your elbow, and that cost $5,000. He wanted to invent a prosthetic hand that was 2 orders of magnitude less expensive, meaning less than $50, including not only the prosthetic hand, but the attachment that would go on the residual limb. That was number 1. Number 2, it had to be very lightweight, because if you looked at the hook prosthetic hand, that probably weighs something around 15 pounds. It's very heavy, uncomfortable, and when it's not needed, the amputees take it off. He wanted a hand with the attachment that weighed less than a pound. Then he wanted a hand that was resistant to dust and water vapor, because that's what you're going to have in the developing world. So he wanted to use materials that were resistant to both of those and wouldn't break down in those kinds of environments. And the 4th and 5th criteria that he had is that he wanted a hand that the amputee could learn to operate in roughly 10 seconds. And better yet, amputee with one good hand could put the prosthetic device on the residual limb and or take it off in less than a minute. And he originally developed a hand for children. He was most concerned about children. And he met every one of those criteria. Fantastic, unbelievable. And they set up a foundation, and that foundation has now provided over 60,000 hands in 70 countries, in every continent but Antarctica. She asked Dr. Wong about having me along on a mission, and I could do prosthetic hands. And so I got started going to Nepal, and the whole AMM mission went to one location. I went to 3 locations to help set up the hand and provide prosthetic hands. And then we went to the Philippines on another mission. And then we decided, okay, we can lead these missions. We have the ability to lead these missions, and we're going to start going to new places. That's a very long answer to a short question.
It's fascinating. So tell me what else Aloha provides. You do the hands, and you talked about surgery, but I wonder what kind of surgery that is.
So the main emphasis of Aloha is to provide free dental services to those who don't have access to and cannot afford dental services in Hawaii. So I have very little involvement in that. I am a director, and so I get involved in some legal issues having to do with that. But mainly, my focus has been on what we do for overseas missions. And our primary emphasis is surgery. I would say our secondary emphasis is to provide dental services. I would say at least half the missions that Margie and I have gone on have involved taking dentists with us, and then dental assistants and hygienists, dental hygienists. And the third emphasis has been the prosthetic hands, which I handle. So those are the 3 areas. The type of surgery that we do is we do general surgery, that's guts and glands. We do gynecologic surgery, and we do plastic surgery, ENT surgery, and minor surgery. We do this on patients that are called ASA 1 or 2. Basically what that means is their only medical problem is the surgical problem. So we're pretty sure we're not going to have complications because we're not operating on people with cardiac problems, pulmonary problems, severe diabetes, and so on. We want to be able to discharge them by the time we leave. And we don't have the kind of equipment that we would have here in the United States, where we have all sorts of scanning equipment. We don't have all the ancillary expertise in other areas of medicine to handle complications that may come up. So we've got to be reasonably assured that we're not going to get complications in terms of the surgery that we do, and that we're going to be able to discharge the patients because, again, there aren't surgeons and there aren't other experts there at the regional and district hospitals where we do our surgery.
And do you train people in the countries in which you work?
Our primary focus is to provide the needed surgery. And we're not there for long periods of time. So there's not a lot of training that we can do. So what we do is, if there are other surgeons there, other anesthesiologists, we invite them in to the operating rooms and we talk to them about what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it. So we do provide training in that way. We are, with some degree of frequency, asked to give talks on various surgical aspects or medical aspects. And if we're asked to do that, we do that, and we'll put on a number of presentations by our surgeons or our anesthesiologists, as the case may be, or potentially even one of the RNs, one of the surgical RNs, registered nurses. I do training for the fitting of prosthetic hands because I want any hospital that we're at to be a center for providing free prosthetic hands to amputees, and I want that to go on year round. So I'm really insistent that they provide us personnel that I can train and that I can leave hands with.
And I know that you also take in a great deal of equipment and medical supplies, and you leave a lot of that behind.
Right. In a normal mission, we'll take in 2,000 pounds of supplies. So we need suction devices, we need cauteries, we need anesthesia machines. And more than that, we need to be sure they're in working order.
Mm.
To the extent they're not in working order, we've got to arrange to get them fixed. If they don't have what we need, to some extent, we can bring the equipment. We have some anesthesia machines. I believe we have 2. And so if necessary, we bring the equipment. All of the surgical instruments that are used for surgery, we bring our own. We don't depend on any of that being there. All the supplies, from medications to drapes to gowns to surgical caps to footwear, we bring with us. And what we don't use, we donate back to the hospital's facility that served as the host hospital.
And what is the criteria for choosing your destinations? Where do you work?
Well, that's my job. I'm very interested in finding new locations because I think that's more of a challenge. I think it makes it more interesting to our volunteers. And so I look around using the internet, talking to people, meeting people, finding out what the needs are, what the possibilities are for getting the temporary licenses, for getting what we need in the host hospital. Like, we want at least 2 operating rooms. We want their consent that we can have 2 operating tables in each room. So we have 4 operating tables that we're working at. So, for instance, I'm now working on possible missions to Bhutan and Greece. So Bhutan, we had a facilitator who's not a medical doctor, but is a doctor, who was born in Greece, speaks Greek, and she helped coordinate our missions to Cambodia. And she was interested in having us do a mission to Greece if we were willing to do that. Greece is probably the poorest of the EU nations, very high unemployment, and they have some pretty significant surgical needs when you go out to the regional and district hospitals. She, in the past, has, through her own foundation, has provided medical supplies and has met with the Minister of Health in Greece. And so she's doing the initial work to see if she can get the Greek government interested in inviting us to come so that they'll grant us the temporary licenses and a host hospital facility to host the surgical mission. In Bhutan, Margie and I visited Bhutan, now going back probably 12 years ago, something like that. And we actually met in person with the Minister of Health at the time about a surgical mission. And unfortunately, that went nowhere. But I had a fellow partner at my law firm who was very close friends with a doctor in Thailand who trained many of the doctors in Bhutan. And I asked the partner, it's a woman partner, Frida Glukov, about putting me in touch with her friend Toy, this Thailand doctor, to see if I could now arrange for a surgical mission in Bhutan. She did put me in touch with her friend, who in turn put me in touch with a former Minister of Health who's friends with the present Minister of Health in Bhutan. And I have been communicating with him, and he has agreed to serve as a coordinator for trying to arrange a surgical mission in Bhutan. So one of the first missions we did was to Honduras, and I was searching around for hospitals that had surgical missions in the past. And I found this unbelievable hospital in Comayagua, Honduras, that was built for the sole purpose of inviting surgical missions from abroad. I could not believe it. It was being run by the Franciscans, and that's all they did was invite surgical missions. At that point in time, they were having about 6 surgical missions a year, and I contacted them, and boy, were they so delighted and the opportunity of having another surgical mission from a brand new organization that they had never dealt with. And Margie and I did 3 surgical missions to Honduras. And then because we had it so well organized, we set it up for a new mission leader to do missions in Honduras. And we continued with new countries.
Who actually does the surgery? Are they volunteers?
We take from normally 30 to 50 people. All of the members of our mission are volunteers, okay? And that means that they're donating their time, they're paying for their own transportation, their own room, and their own board. That is unbelievable if you think about it, because most of these people are nurses or medical assistants and lay people. They only get like 2 weeks of vacation a year. And to the extent they get that, they're spending all their vacation time to do these missions. They're not people that are making $100,000 or more a year, and yet they're willing to spend their money for their transportation, their room, and their board to do this. Unbelievable, fantastic volunteers, and we can't have a mission without them. So we have the nurses, we have medical assistants, we have lay people, and of course, most importantly, we have surgeons and we have anesthesiologists.
And in terms of the equipment and the medication and so on, how is all that side of it funded?
We've been able to run these missions through a combination of supply donations. So we have certain nonprofit organizations who provide medical supplies to hospitals, to state organizations, and to groups like us that do surgical missions, and also to nonprofits that do medical missions. So AmeriCares is one of the biggest ones, and they each mission they supply a considerable amount of supplies. We also have made a point of going around to most of our volunteers were from Southern California, because that's where Margie and I lived, that's where Margie worked. And she got great donations from St. John's Hospital, from Santa Monica Hospital, from various surgery centers. And we would collect them during the year and we would store them. And then we had $5,000 mostly for medications that we had to buy because we just couldn't get them. For the most part, at least in the early years, we were able to use out-of-date medications. In the United States, you can't do that except the military insists that there be no time period with respect to the medications. With the exception of, I think, 2 medications, it happens when medications are older is they're not quite as efficacious, meaning that you have to use a little more of the medication. And we were able to use outdated sutures and other materials. Mesh is the other main material. And that limited the expenses that we incurred for some of the supplies. More recently, the mission sites have insisted that we use in-date medications, which cost probably an extra $5,000 to do that. They have not insisted on that for sutures and mesh, which allows us to save expenses. So most of the missions have been run for $5,000.
Extraordinary. Can you tell us about a case that had particular resonance for you? I know you had a happy occasion with an architect in Honduras.
You're absolutely right. The fellow came in with his wife and 1 child, and he had been drafted into the Honduran military, and his job was to handle live ordnance. And I'm trying to remember whether he was a double amputee. I think he may have been a double amputee. This goes back a decade, so I'm not quite sure. But in any case, there are 2 really important functions for an architect, particularly in the developing world. He's got to have the ability to write and to be able to draw. he was not able to do either one of those things, and he had not been able to work as an architect since the loss of his hand or hands. And I fitted him with a prosthetic hand, and he proceeded to write with his prosthetic hand, "Thank you" and "God bless you" and things like that. And then he proceeded to draw a bird, a beautiful drawing of a bird. And then he went on to draw a building in the kind of fashion and way that only an architect could draw a building. Unbelievable details. And it was clear to him and to his wife that he would be able to resume his work as an architect. And he was all smiles, and his wife was crying. And it was such a pleasure to be able to restore this person to his profession and give him his life back in terms of being able to do what he was trained to do, what he clearly loved to do. It was a fantastic feeling. You know, as a lay person, you don't have that kind of opportunity to do those kinds of things for people where you're really restoring, in a sense, their health and making them a really productive individual. Doctors have that opportunity, but as lay people, we don't. And this was extraordinary for me to be able to do that.
And I mean, just looking at these figures, I mean, I guess some of these are slightly out of date now, but 142 overseas missions, 22 countries served, 274,000 mission patients seen, 343,077 mission surgeries performed. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Over 5,000 volunteers. I mean, you've done a huge, huge amount all over the world.
And I did a very small part of that. We have, as you indicated, a tremendous number of volunteers. I would say they've been mainly from Hawaii and from Southern California. But having said that, they're coming from all over the United States, from Canada, and sometimes from elsewhere outside of North America. So it's an extraordinary group of people. And it's this team that really makes it work. Aloha was organized in 1983, I believe. It was organized by Hawaiians of Filipino descent, and their intent was to give back to their country of origin, the Philippines. And that's how it started. And it expanded from the Philippines to Nepal, and basically to a limited number of countries. And then I became involved, now going back over a decade, and I've expanded it to Central America, to South America, to mainland Asia, and to other countries in Southeast Asia. So we're now really going to a lot of different countries.
And how has COVID impacted your work?
It's had a tremendous impact. Margie and I have not gone on a mission since January of 2020. The last mission was in Cambodia, and we recognized that going forward, we have to have a number of different things. All our volunteers have to be vaccinated. We have to have COVID testing equipment because we want to be sure that all our would-be surgical patients don't have COVID, because they may pass it on to other patients, to the staff. So we don't want to be operating on the COVID patients, and we have to have personal protective equipment. As of about 2 months ago, I felt that we could meet all of those requirements, and that's when I started to look for new missions.
And so now, what are your future plans?
Well, our future plans are to start going to countries where they have a relatively high vaccination rate and are interested in having us come there as a surgical team. And we're going to go there with fully vaccinated volunteers. We're going to have tests for COVID-19. We're going to have personal protective equipment. And that's how we're going to do it.
And tell me, can our listeners donate to AMM, to Aloha?
AlohaMedicalMission.org would be delighted for them to go on the website and donate money. If they just donate money, I would venture to say that most of it is going to go for providing dental services in Hawaii, because that's how most of the money is used. If they specify that it's for the surgical missions abroad, then it will go as directed by the donors. So that's up to the donors as to whether they want to specify how the money is to be used. But again, it's Aloha Medical Mission, all one word, .org.
Art, just huge congratulations and gratitude for the work that you and Marjorie and Aloha do. Thank you so much for telling me.
I want to emphasize, it's not us, it's the volunteers that make this go. This is a team effort. But for those fantastic volunteers we have, we couldn't do what we do.
Well, my hearty congratulations to everybody involved. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Well, thank you very much, Georgina. I've enjoyed it.